Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? For a long time, Intel has been one of the leaders in CPU development, helping to push computers to be faster and faster. But a recent online article suggests that the company has been struggling to keep up even more than we may have realized. It spells doom for Intel, but I'm not sure I'm buying it. Okay, fair warning, this is a very geeky episode about a highly complex topic, so I simply can't cover every detail about it. I'm gonna address this at a level that helps keep the podcast moving along, but I'll include links to additional reading and my sources down in the description if you want to learn more about all of this. So, in late October 2018, a report was published on the site called SemiAccurate that says Intel has decided to kill off development of its 10 nanometer CPU process, which was codenamed Cannon Lake. SemiAccurate is kind of a blog, and it focuses on the semiconductor industry and news and upcoming events and all that kind of stuff, analysis. Basically, it's just all about chips and CPUs and that sort of thing. And I have some serious problems with this particular article. First, it opens with a number of quotes from previous articles on that site. They were all cherry-picked and are basically meant to lead the reader into a told you so kind of scenario where all the quotes were basically leading up to this particular announcement of Intel supposedly killing off this development. It also has references to sources from within Intel that told the author about this recent thing because Intel hasn't officially announced it, yet none of those sources are named. They're all simply referred to as, quote, trusted moles. Furthermore, there have been no technical details listed in the article about just what led Intel to supposedly stopping development. Yes, we know Intel has been struggling to reach 10 nanometers in its process, but one would think that there would at least be some bit of information from one of those unnamed sources to explain exactly why. What was the specific technical hurdle that Intel just couldn't overcome, and what led it to the decision that it supposedly made? None of that was covered, basically just that Intel just killed it. Also, there's no additional quotes or insight from other industry experts, right? Hey, I heard this thing that Intel may be doing. Does that make sense to you? Ask those kinds of questions, right? None of that is covered in this particular story. Also, there's a lot of snark in this particular article, especially around how Intel has been handling the repeated delays of the launch of these 10 nanometer CPUs, the whole Cannon Lake platform. And it's just snark about Intel's marketing and how they've been playing this one out. So there's definitely a chip on the shoulder of the author of this article, and it's made very clear that he has a very low opinion of Intel. Now, what's even more interesting is this article is the only one of its kind that came out. It's not like those sources supposedly talked to any other media outlets. And so when this particular article dropped, it made the tech news circle. I remember it popping up in a lot of other news feeds, a lot of other tech blogs and sites that I frequent. And the interesting thing is the author of this particular article at SemiAccurate was unable to comment to any other reporters or media outlets about this article because he was supposedly out traveling. Okay, now maybe that's true. Maybe he was out traveling. That's fine. But if you're going to drop a supposed bombshell report like this, because it is a pretty big deal if Intel is actually killing off its 10 nanometer process, wouldn't you want to be around to answer those questions? This is potentially a huge scoop for this site and this particular author. wouldn't you want to like schedule this story to come out when you would actually be available to answer questions and get even more media exposure to this story? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense that you would just drop this article and then not be available for potentially days afterwards. And then finally, the biggest problem that I have with this article is that at the end of it, it starts talking about how supposedly killing off 10 nanometers is a good thing for Intel, and that the author thinks it's the right decision, and offers his own analysis of what's going on and why it's a good decision. He goes in to justify this decision, but all of that part of it is locked behind a paywall for so-called professional level subscribers. Okay, I can understand maybe a smaller media outlet, they, need to pay bills, so they do the above the fold kind of stuff, like just the facts of it. Maybe that's ad supported and available freely. And then if you want further information, okay, maybe you need a subscription. That makes sense. And I even considered buying a subscription just so I could read the rest of that article and, understand it so I can comment on it better. But here's the thing. A professional level subscription costs $1,000 a year. What? You're going to drop a bombshell article like this, not give me any named sources, not get any other industry analysis of it. It's literally just the one author saying, this is what I heard. Here's the story. I'm going to talk trash about Intel through this article. And then if you want to understand why I think it's a good thing, pay me $1,000? Yeah, no, that immediately takes this whole story from being, okay, maybe it's credible, but just not professionally written. It takes it from that to just being, this is clickbait. I don't have very much trust at all in this story. Could it be true? Could there be a kernel of truth to this story? Yeah, maybe, but it doesn't smell right, and I just don't trust it at face value. Now, of course, Intel immediately came out because this story is making the news rounds and it's starting to affect Intel's stock price at the time it came out. Intel came out from its PR department and said, no, this is not true. We're still on track to release Cannon Lake in 2019. There's no truth to this article. And of course, the author of this article did a quick little update to it and said, here's what Intel said, and we still stand by our article. So basically, not only are they saying, sticking to their story about Intel supposedly killing off Cannon Lake, but also that they're calling Intel's PR department a bunch of liars. Yeah, that's the internet for you. So what's the deeper thing on this, right? Like, this is just a one-off thing. And ever since this story broke afterwards, it quickly faded and no one has said anything else about it since. It very just quickly got buried and other news, came around and it hasn't really stuck around. So there is, of course, some bit of truth to it. And I think that might be what's most interesting to examine here. Let's unpack all of that, because some criticism of Intel, I think, is a bit warranted in this case. I mean, the guy in the article seemed just a little bit too hell-bent on trash talking Intel, but I can understand the frustration from a lot of computer and, CPU enthusiasts as to what's been going on with Intel and this 10 nanometer process. So first, let's even cover what the whole process size thing even means. What does that have to do with anything? Well, the CPU process size, it refers to the dimensions of individual features like transistors in the die of a chip. It's basically the smallest size that any teeny little piece of a CPU can be. A smaller process size, the smaller you make it, gets you a few benefits. The first thing is that the individual transistors, which are what makes up like the CPU, what makes it be able to calculate things, the smaller the transistor, the faster you can turn it on and off. meaning you can make it do work more and more quickly. Also, the smaller the transistor size, the smaller the process size, it means you can pack more and more transistors into a given area. You can make CPUs more dense. And then it also allows you to get more dies per silicon wafer when you're manufacturing them, and that lowers the cost per die. CPUs aren't manufactured one die at a time. They're printed on these large, circular wafers of silicon and then kind of cut out afterwards. And that allows you to produce more and more of them if you can, efficiently and effectively, if you can shrink the size of each. You get more per die. It makes basic sense. Now, the problem with decreasing process size is that it becomes increasingly harder to manufacture them. Not so much in terms of designing them. I mean, there are companies that are already moving on to 7 nanometer and starting to gear up for 5 nanometer processes. 10 nanometers is fairly new. It's really just the manufacturing, the physical aspect of producing these dies, these chips, that are what holds companies back. The way CPUs are made is referred to as silicon or photolithography. And just like lithography on paper, like how books are made, silicon lithography uses a mask to essentially print the features onto a silicon wafer. It's like a stencil, I guess you could say. So the smaller the process size, the harder it is to make those masks because accuracy becomes more and more important. You've got less wiggle room, I guess you could say, in terms of, being able to produce these where all of the features or the majority of the features work correctly. Now, to be clear, in Intel's case, its problem isn't producing 10 nanometer chips at all. In fact, Intel already makes one called the i3-8121U. That's a laptop chip based on that Cannon Lake platform, but rather Intel's problem is making them cost effectively. Apparently, the yield rates out of manufacturing chips at 10 nanometers for Intel are pretty low. They're not getting a whole lot of them that work per silicon wafer. Therefore, their costs are too high to actually produce those dies. And that's what they've been struggling with trying to do. Basically, getting the accuracy to work better for them, getting a sufficient number, a cost-effective number of properly made dies out of each silicon wafer. So what about the competition? Everyone keeps focusing on Intel and how it's struggling, yet you might have heard about other manufacturers that are offering CPUs on like a 7 nanometer process. TSMC and Samsung are two to think of. And at first glance, yeah, it makes it sound like Intel is ridiculously behind. Intel's current CPU generation is still on a 14 nanometer process. And so everyone's like, well, if Intel's still on 14 nanometer and everyone else is moving to 7 and Intel's struggling to get to 10 nanometers, well, what hope does Intel even have? Like, they're way behind. Well, here's the thing. The process size that we hear about, that number, it's really more of a marketing and nomenclature kind of a thing. It doesn't necessarily accurately translate to real CPU performance because there are a bunch of other factors too. More or less, any manufacturer can claim, well, this is what our process size is, and that could be true, it could be false. There are just so many other variables in play. We're saying, well, okay, this one company is manufacturing at 7 nanometers, doesn't necessarily mean that they're producing significantly faster chips. It just means that they've managed to shrink one attribute of their processors down to that particular size. One of the big things that actually translates into better CPU performance is transistor density. Now, we already kind of talked about how smaller transistors can lead to more density, but it's up to manufacturers to actually deliver on that higher density potential. Just because you can produce transistors that are that much smaller doesn't necessarily mean the manufacturers have the technology or the ability to pack them in that much tighter and maintain that level of accuracy. And that's actually the ace up Intel's sleeve. That's really what Intel has been struggling with, is that they've been trying to push the density level along with shrinking that process size. I found a chart over on a site called WCCF Tech that compares transistor density by manufacturer and process. And it shows that as time has gone on, density across all manufacturers has improved, as you'd expect. But the chart specifically compares the 7nm processes from Samsung, TSMC, and Global Foundries against Intel's upcoming 10nm process. It shows that Samsung is at about 95 million transistors per square millimeter. TSMC is about 96 million, so not too far off. Global Foundries just a little bit further ahead at 98 million. But Intel's Cannon Lake is at 106 million transistors per square millimeter. So it's showing that Intel is really going for density. The more transistors you can pack into a chip, the more work that chip can get done in a given amount of time. Now, can we trust those numbers? That's an individual source. Well, I don't think they're far off, especially considering that Tech Insights got its hands on one of those i3-8121U chips. They're shipping in a specific model of Lenovo IdeaPad laptop. They stuck one of those chips under a microscope and did the math, and they found that it's over 100 million transistors per square millimeter. So the numbers start to actually match up. And furthermore, if you look at one of Intel's own slides showing its roadmap from not too long ago, those numbers jive. But it also specifies, and signifies rather, a major jump from its current 14nm process. Tech Insights says that the new 10nm process is 2.7 times more dense than 14 nanometers. Intel's roadmap lists 14 nanometers at 37.5 million transistors per square millimeter. So you're going from 37.5 million to over 100 million. That is a massive jump in density. Of course, Intel is going to have to put some serious money and time into investments to get to that point. That is a much bigger jump than what they had previously seen on a year-to-year kind of basis. And everyone's always been holding Intel to this whole, hey, you need to come out with significantly faster CPUs every year kind of a thing. Yeah, Intel is going to struggle to make that big of a jump in a relatively short period of time. So it makes sense that they're delayed, right? Intel initially planned to move to the 10 nanometer process like back in 2015. And it's repeatedly pushed back the launch date. And I can understand the frustration that people have with that, because they're basically saying, okay, 2015, we're going to have this major jump, and then 2015 rolls around, and they're like, okay, well, there's a delay. We need to push it back a year. Everyone's like, okay, well, we understand, it's a big jump. Maybe this stuff takes time, right? But then to continue to push it back year after year after year, I can understand the frustration that people have with Intel over that sort of thing, right? To promise one thing and not deliver on it, and then repeatedly not deliver on it, while just continuing to do some minor iterative updates to its existing tech. 14 nanometer hasn't really been advanced all that, far in the interim years since when it first started. Basically, Intel has just been doing kind of the, old school approach of, well, let's just throw more cores at it, or let's just try to increase the clock speed a little bit faster. Well, okay, so I'm going to admit and completely agree with the people who are frustrated with Intel. Yeah, it's a tough situation, and yeah, it's been embarrassing for Intel as well, because it's not only, shown that Intel, who has normally been regarded as one of the leaders in pushing CPU performance forward, it's showing that even they are struggling at some of this kind of stuff. And it's also making up, some questions about like the future of the company. Like they've done so well for so long. And yeah, we know things have kind of slowed down in the CPU development front, but this has been a delay, the kind of delay that we've never seen out of Intel before. But I don't think the concept of canceling the entire 10 nanometer process makes any bit of sense. They seem to actually be making progress with it, especially considering they've already shipped at least one CPU on it. So we know that they're technically capable of manufacturing CPUs that way. They've also spent obviously a ton of money on it, especially over the last several years. So one would think that Intel would have come to a conclusion earlier on, hey, this is not financially viable for us to continue to pursue this whole 10 nanometer thing and the way that they chose to pursue it. Intel is not stupid, especially when they're spending tons of money on R&D. They're going to be looking at every step in the process. Are we making good progress? Are we on track to get a return on our investment? For them to go over 4 years and then say, well, you know what, screw it, we're not going to do this anymore after having spent all that money on R&D. Again, that just doesn't make a whole ton of sense. They've come too far and they're already starting to manufacture. I think this is really just a matter of time that they just need to keep, pushing, and they'll eventually get there. I don't think they're struggling on any one large particular problem. I think they're just facing a whole bunch of smaller little problems that kind of are compounding on each other, and they just need to start working through those a piece at a time. And once they get through all of them, then suddenly they'll reach the production volume that they need to get. And the other thing, of course, is killing off their 10 nanometer process really just makes no sense, because they have to learn how to make process improvements like that anyway. For Intel to just say, you know what, we're not going to do 10 nanometer after all, we're just going to be done, basically means end of the line for Intel CPUs, because it's an iterative type of thing. If they can't manufacture CPUs reliably at 10 nanometers, what's to say they're going to be able to do that at 7 nanometers or 5 nanometers, right? They've got to get through these challenges in order to continue on anyway. So in a ways, it's like a blessing in disguise that these other foundries have started nipping at Intel's heels, because one, it's brought a lot of this kind of stuff to light and shown that not all CPUs are created equal, right? Yes, we've seen some incredible advancement from other foundries. AMD has been really stepping things up. They use global foundries. ARM-based processors have really been improving in performance and all of that. And so that bit of competition is really good for Intel, but it also just goes to highlight that it's not always an apples to apples comparison when you're looking at the way CPUs work. You can't say this 2 gigahertz CPU is just as fast as this other 2 gigahertz CPU, or this CPU running on a smaller process size is going to be faster than this other one on a larger process size, because there are way more factors to take into account. So this issue, I guess, is just bringing to light the relative disparity there are between CPU architectures and manufacturers, but also because those other companies catching up and starting to see those improvements and not letting Intel be way out in the lead all the time generally means better processors for all kinds of devices, not just the types of CPUs that Intel produces, not just PCs and laptops. I mean, have you seen the benchmarks off of smartphones and tablets lately? It's pretty crazy just how fast these tiny portable mobile devices have become relative to mainstream larger devices like laptops and desktops. So, competition is always a good thing. It's keeping some heat on Intel, but it really shows that, hubris can really get to companies. Not to say that Intel was resting on its laurels or anything like that along the way. I mean, Intel enjoyed for many years a dramatic lead in terms of, processor performance. There was a long time when AMD CPUs really just couldn't perform compared to what Intel was offering. And if you wanted a fast CPU for a computer, they were pretty much the best choice. And so I don't think, in this whole 10 nanometer thing, hubris was really what, I don't want to say brought Intel down, but brought these challenges to them, but rather it's more that they could have just taken a better approach to it. I think they could have been a bit less aggressive and taken a more iterative approach when it came to Cannon Lake, when it came to 10 nanometers. Maybe shrink the process size, but don't worry so much about density right off the bat. You know what I mean? Like, try to work on density as a thing that you do over time. Maybe do that as part of the whole iterative year after year type of approach. Get back to what Intel used to do with the whole so-called tick-tock type of cycle, where one year they'd implement a new process size and then the next year they would optimize it. Maybe they could have continued to do the same thing with Cannon Lake, where the first gen of them was 10 nanometers, but not that much more dense. And then the next year, they start to work on getting the density where it needs to be. All along the way, they would be improving performance. They would be delivering, better and better CPUs, but it wouldn't have been such a big jump. It wouldn't have been like, from one year to the next, now the CPU is like twice as fast, if not more. I just think they could have taken this a little bit more slowly and worked their way up to it. It probably would have taken them the same amount of time from then until now to get to the process density size that they wanted, but they wouldn't have been stringing everyone along in the process. And I think even Intel tends to agree with this, because former Intel CEO Brian Krzanich even admitted in an earnings call back, and I think it was April 2018, that the company was just a bit too aggressive with its plans for 10 nanometer. It bit off more than it could chew. So yeah, this has definitely been a misstep on Intel's part, and it's caused a lot of frustration, and it's given competition an opportunity to catch up to Intel. But in the grand scheme of things, I think it just goes to underscore that we can't take technological advancement for granted. We've been too used to seeing these amazing changes year after year. At some point, it's going to slow down. At some point, we're going to have to face reality that we're coming up against a wall when it comes to our manufacturing capability or our knowledge or some other factor. And so, while Moore's Law may no longer truly apply, it doesn't mean that we've reached the limit of processor design. In fact, with all of this going on, I think things are finally starting to get really interesting. So with that, I'm curious as to your thoughts. Have you been keeping tabs on the whole Cannon Lake saga from Intel, these new CPUs, and how they've been failing to deliver? Is that something you've been keeping up on because you've eagerly anticipated them, or maybe you're just heavily invested into Intel CPUs, they're your favorite, or maybe vice versa, maybe you're really big into AMD and you've been keeping tabs on Intel to see where the competition is at? Do you think there's much life left in the whole x86 platform, or are we looking at a major architectural change for all sorts of computational devices coming sooner rather than later? I'm just curious as to your thoughts about this whole scenario, because maybe the article that started all of it wasn't necessarily 100% accurate, and maybe wasn't that really big of a deal if it was untrue, but it does shed some really interesting light on a situation that I don't think that many people have thought all that seriously about. So hit me up down in the comments section with your thoughts. Also, if you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, I have them available for Patreon supporters at all contribution levels. They're plain MP3 downloads, plus there's private RSS feed support. You get your own URL, throw it into the podcast player of your choice. And these episodes usually come out a few days before they go live on YouTube. So if you're interested in that and you want to help support the channel, that's something to consider. Anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.